welcome to Critical Conversations. I'm Nina Schoonover.
I'm Emma Revem.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about racial mismatch and culturally relevant pedagogy. And so before we really start talking about the readings, we wanted to situate our backgrounds and who we both are as teachers as we start talking about particularly charter schools and our experiences with culturally relevant teaching. So yeah, I'll let Emma go first.
So I was a high school teacher in Durham at one of the large public high schools in Durham, North Carolina for 8 years. I don't know how edgy it is to say this, but I have been known to be a charter school hater in the past. Well, we could say critic if we want to be more neutral, but that's just where I come from. I have a lot of critiques of how charter schools and public schools are kind of in this battle in North Carolina specifically, and so I kind of have opinions about that, and they might come out, and so I just wanted to go ahead and say at the forefront, that's how I feel.
Awesome. Yeah, and so my background is that I taught in a private school that was just for girls. I've also taught in public school. I've also student taught in a charter school. I taught in another private school. So I've been in all of them. So I'm a little bit maybe more diplomatic in the in the regard of charter versus public. But I think that that's important to talk about before we get into some of our critiques of the readings that we had.
Right. So just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So this is our first slide. I thought this was really fascinating. This is a map of North Carolina and the different charter schools in each of the different counties. I know it's kind of blurry from here, but maybe you can see that the white counties have 0 charter schools, and then blue is 1 to 2, yellow is 3 to 5, pink is 6 to 15, and green is 16 to 25. So there's only 2 counties that have over 16 charter schools, which are Wake and Mecklenburg, and then the other large counties are Guilford and Durham. So it kind of makes sense that they're concentrated into the more urban populations, but we also thought that was really interesting in thinking about a rural and urban divide between charter schools.
Mm-hmm. And in North Carolina, a lot of what I consider to be kind of my critiques involve around urbanicity, and kind of like what you see there. So that's kind of relevant to see that that's where the charter schools are. And there are definitely multiple types of charter schools, but the ones we're thinking about are the ones that kind of show this racial mismatch or don't show it, according to the Renzulli article. So we're going to kind of jump into that. So I was actually just proud of myself that I could get through this article. I don't know if anybody else in the audience felt like their quant skills have made an improvement and they could actually maybe understand some of the variables, maybe some of the results. I see some hands out there. Anybody feel like they were like, yeah, I got this? Or at least a little bit. Yeah, I know some of these words, Chelsea said. I mean, it was like pages and pages of tables, which I know how to format now because of my quant class. So, I feel good about that.
Well, and I'm on the other end where none of it made sense. I'm completely a qualitative researcher, so I relied on Emma to explain the tables to me.
Right. So one thing that we noticed that we kind of wanted to talk about first was the issue of autonomy. As it relates to charter schools, because they found autonomy is one of the strongest predicting variables in teacher satisfaction. So if you remember, the article is about how mismatched do teachers feel being satisfied in their schools if they're in a school that has a different racial makeup than they have. And so they decided to measure their variable of satisfaction. I had kind of an issue with that. They chose 4, they only had the data that they had, but they chose 4 kind of questions from a study, and they were rating satisfaction on whether the teacher felt satisfied at their current school, whether they thought it was a waste of time. I'm on page 30 if anyone wants to go. Whether they thought it was a waste of time to try their best, whether they would become a teacher again, and how long they plan to remain in teaching is kind of how they measured satisfaction. And if you look on page 41, if anyone's following along, or just for reference, what they found was that once they controlled for autonomy, the charter schools were no longer associated with increased satisfaction, but rather decreased satisfaction. So if you sift through all that, basically what that said to me was charter school teachers were overall showed more satisfaction and less of a mismatch if they were in a school where the racial makeup of the students was different from their own race. However, the thing that might have been driving it was that at charter schools, they feel more autonomous in their teaching experience, meaning they had more control either over their classroom or over their school experience. And if you took that out and you just controlled for autonomy, meaning everybody of the same autonomy level, if they felt autonomous, actually charter schools had less satisfaction and showed more of a racial mismatch is kind of how I'm reading that, or just less satisfaction in general. So I thought that was interesting. What did you think, Nina?
Yeah, I thought a lot about the autonomy piece from my own background in teaching in charter schools because my first, when I student taught, was at a school that was 9th through 12th graders mixed within the class. So I was teaching English to students in 4 different grade levels. But I also had a lot of freedom to create that curriculum because each year they have to change their curriculum because you have the same students each year. So that was just really a very different setting than when I taught in public school and was kind of mandated certain tasks. And when we get into culturally relevant and thinking about the freedom to create culturally relevant curricula, it doesn't exist as much in a public school setting. And then the same thing when I taught in a private school. I had more freedom to create my curriculum, and then I had to be more conscious of culturally relevant teaching. But the private school was in Texas, and it was a Christian school, and there were a lot of mismatches there between myself and the students in terms of our political views, cultural views, and so that became really interesting too. So it is an interesting finding.
Yeah, and I would say I taught at a public school. I didn't have autonomy really. I mean, I had to follow the earth science. That's why I taught standards in the AP environmental science. But I had definitely more autonomy than people at my school who taught a tested subject like biology, where they had to have like meetings all the time and be on a pacing guide by the day, do this common assessments. And so I would definitely say that those types of teachers tended to feel less satisfied because they didn't have the options to wiggle as much with the curriculum and do what they wanted to do. And I feel like that's crucial to a teacher's satisfaction, is feeling like, if they feel this mismatch, can I do something about it? Am I the type of person that's going to do something about it? Do I have the space to do something about that? We felt like that had a connection. And we wanted to see if anybody in the audience had any connection about their own experiences with regard to autonomy. And you can say, yeah, I was at a public school and I felt this, or I was at a charter school and I felt that. Oh, yeah. Okay.
I've taught in both environments. Both environments. um, when I was in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, I taught in the private sector. But their curriculum was so different, but you had to follow it. I'm now in the public school, and I feel like I'm just free. Because what I do get results. And so I'm able to do what I want to do, if that sounds good.
That's interesting, yeah. It has to get results, I feel like, for people to let you do what you want to do.
So I taught at a public high school. It was a magnet school in early college, but I was so happy that first year that I started working there, which was also my first year of teaching, because the week before I started, my principal said, okay, you're going to teach 11th grade American literature. I looked at her and I said, great. Do I have to follow any specific curriculum or anything you have to give me? And she said, nope, do what you want. Teach American literature, do it your way. And when I tell people this story, they look at me like, what? And I know that that's very unusual, and that's how my entire career at that school played out. I could do pretty much whatever I wanted as long as I was hitting those skills the Common Core standards wanted to see hit. And so I was very free, and I was very, very, very happy in that regard. And so I really could try to make it more personalized for my students. But recently, for a project that I'm working on for a different class, I'm working with a 9th grade teacher who is having trouble implementing what we're going to implement in terms of this tech tool, because she has a scripted curriculum, and so she doesn't have that much room. And I know that she's frustrated, and it's actually frustrating for me as a secondary person working in that environment. You know, and I don't even work there, and I'm very frustrated. So I've seen both sides of that coin.
I would just like to add that I told you guys I teach a graduate course, and 3 of the students in there teach at a local high school. And they actually teach the same subject, Math 1, which is tested. And I taught at that very same high school. I know, small town. But I taught Math 2 and Math 3, which is not a state tested area. And I enjoyed it because I could really teach what I wanted as long as the kids did well. You know, the principal was happy. This semester, 2 of the 3 students have already um, expressed their desire to leave the classroom because the class that I'm teaching focuses on problem solving, you know, and implementing problem solving into, you know, the mathematics classroom, and they're saying that they can't because the tests they give are mandated. They have a pacing guide they have to stick to. They can't be behind no more than 2 days or they get in trouble. And they're great teachers, but they don't want to stay, and they're getting more education so they can leave because they're not happy. So.
Yeah, and while we're moving the mic around, just to connect to that, I feel like that's something that they couldn't really control for based on the data that they had. Like, do you teach a tested course? Like, do you teach a like high need area like Math 1 where a lot of students it's a barrier to their further math skills, right? So I feel like that's something that matters for your satisfaction as well.
I guess in response to Jessica's point, sometimes I feel like the autonomy can be like a double-edged sword because it allots for people not to teach cultural relevance, or there's a mismatch with cultural relevance based on the students that you're teaching. So if the teacher's cultural relevance is mismatched with the students, that oftentimes that autonomy will allot for students not to be engaged in the curriculum. An example of that, when I was taking a class in my master's, one of my professors worked with one of the local middle schools, and there were no books in one of the English classes that was taught by that was written by a person of color that was used in there. So the teacher had autonomy, and these are the books that they chose. Also, as I was like interviewing for teaching positions back in the day, I interviewed at public schools and I interviewed at charter schools. And at charter schools, at one of the charter schools, I had to do a teaching demonstration in my interview. And so I had a lot of autonomy. I taught real students in that lesson. And I ultimately chose not to go with that job based on some of that cultural mismatch and like racial mismatch in the school, even though I was going to be teaching a subject, history, where I would have a lot of autonomy. But I wasn't comfortable enough with my skill set in pedagogy and that environment to move forward. And so I think that halted me to potentially make a difference because of some of those things.
Just to jump off that before we move the mic. Yeah, that's sort of what I was saying too with my experience when I taught in Texas, just to use myself as an example, because the first job I got after I finished my licensure and my master's was teaching at the high school that I went to. And there was, while it was a tested subject, I taught 11th grade and I had a whole course of students who had all failed the tests the year before. So it was basically a remediation class, which I had no autonomy over really. It was just teaching to a test. But I knew my students really well. Like they knew who I was. I knew their siblings, their cousins, everybody, because it was a small town. And then I moved to Texas. And while I had autonomy and I had to really think about their cultural backgrounds, it took me a lot. I was there for 2 years and it was still really hard to figure out what their needs were as conservative Texan students, like that wasn't my background at all. So no matter how like relevant I tried to be, it was a really difficult experience as a teacher, even though you have that freedom.
So my experience has been, I taught biology, which is a state tested science, EOC, in a traditional public high school and a charter public high school. And so I did find that my autonomy was kind of altered. So in the traditional public high school, I usually kind of felt, I guess, bogged down by the older members of my PLC especially. And so I kind of wonder if there's maybe like a generational thing that could play into it, because I know that at the charter school when I moved there was also a lot younger teachers that were closer to my age there. And teaching the same state tested subject, I felt way more autonomous in the charter school, thinking that I didn't think the only way to do well in the EOC was memorization. You could still teach in these other ways. So my experience was, I guess, just different in that way.
Can you clarify the acronym you just?
Which one?
You were talking about in your leadership group. What's it called?
Oh, a PLC, professional learning community. So that's like the meeting every week, or having to do common planning, or submit lesson plans, do the same assessments, things like that.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to some of the gaps in the study, and like I had already said, not all of the data necessarily makes sense to me, as I don't do a lot of quantitative work. But for me, as a qualitative researcher, it speaks to needing to hear more of the stories of the participants in this study. So I just really wanted to know, like, these teachers' experiences. What were their relationships with their students? What were their relationships with their peer teachers in their PLCs? What was leading them to leave? I just had a lot of questions about that, and that seems to be some of the gaps that is in this particular study. But
Yeah, I agree. I think that's definitely true. I don't want to spend too much time. I have a million things I could also say about things I found in here, but we don't have to do it. We can move on. It's kind of like me when I was reading. I read the quant paper first, and then it was like drinking a nice glass of cold water, reading Gloria Ladson Billings. I was like, whew, it makes so much sense. It's so nice. I don't know. Just that was me.
yeah, so we have this as well. It's a talking about funding with charter schools and how it is given to them, kind of via public, in a way, like this cartoon over here that's showing them like literally taking the bricks from a public school to build the charter school. So if you follow some of the funding lines of how charter schools are actually funded, it can be a little problematic.
Yeah, and I mean, that was something we noticed in here too. They didn't really have any qualities about the school. I didn't know what types of schools these teachers were in that were taking this survey, and the only variable they kind of had access to was we found kind of questionable, was that how the teacher rated the quality of their students. And so that is like so subjective, and it can be kind of a group mentality, like these kids, fill in the blanks. And so I'm trying to see, okay, I wrote it like on my notes kind of crazily. They tried to say something about, I put all these sticky notes. What good is it? Okay. On page 28, they said, it's when they're theorizing why there might be more racial mismatches places. It said white teachers may be less satisfied teaching black students when those schools are given less respect and attention and ultimately less status than other schools. And then I highlighted, it was like maybe also fewer resources. I mean, housing inequality and like systemic racism. I know Chelsea posted to the forum, I just like saw it, was a new study. I think it was you, Chelsea, like an article to the just like interesting articles talking about how in segregated schools that are also connected, like you find that it's connected to poverty, right? So poverty comes from housing values, leads to resources that schools get, leads to, you might not be satisfied if you're worried about where the resources are that you can get to teach. You might want to try to do something cool, but then you just don't have the resources for that, or it takes more energy and you're already low on energy for any number of reasons. So I just feel like they didn't measure it and they kind of didn't maybe have the data, but the type of school and the funding that the school gets really is a huge difference between charter and public, along with autonomy, and we felt like that was a gap.
Yeah. And then as we were transitioning into thinking about the next article about culturally relevant teaching, we kind of were questioning, like, do charter schools or public schools meet the needs of the communities that they serve? And that's, or even private schools as well, but are they meeting the needs that a community truly needs? If we have some time, we have a little very brief video that we want to show you about that explains culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy directly from some of the scholars that actually use this work. So we'll show that to you now.
I think people, when they use the term culturally responsive or culturally relevant pedagogy, forget that the base of the word is culture. So culture has to do with worldviews, beliefs, language. It has to do with values.
Culture, to me, at its essence, are the things that, those filters that help us as human beings make sense out of the most ordinary things. Culture can be grouped into two different kind of categories. You can talk about visible culture and invisible culture, or tangible and intangible. The tangible, I would translate that to say the crafts, the music, the art, the technology. And those are important, but I think the more important are the intangible. And these are values, beliefs, feelings, opinions, perspectives, assumptions.
So, in thinking about culturally relevant pedagogy, I like this line of thinking about culture into education versus bringing education into culture, and I want to kind of bring that out to you all and what you thought of that particular quote, and your experiences with that. Like, were you prepped in your teacher prep program to use culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy? Do you use that now? Any thoughts that I want to call on my audience?
I, for example, did not have explicit teaching on culturally relevant pedagogy. I kind of learned through the grapevine, but didn't have it in my toolbox when I was starting out at the school where I taught. Yeah. I think Gary has one over there.
One thing that came to mind was during my pre-service teacher training was we had to all take an ESL course, and the only context I had ever talked about culturally relevant teaching was when working with ESL students. And at the time, a lot of my professors, looking back on it, were confusing culturally relevant teaching with something like a modification or accommodation, which isn't really getting at the heart of it. So they, using graphic organizers is an example of culturally relevant teaching for ESL students. And now looking back on it, it's like, that's very much not, necessarily true. But it's interesting that now reflecting on that, that's how like a whole host of teachers were being trained at a public UNC school. So it's just kind of interesting since you asked that question.
Yeah, also thinking of the putting culture into education, in particular with ESL or ELL students, we're going to have a party for Day of the Dead, like I'm being culturally relevant, and how that can be problematic also.
Thank you. So in my experience as a teacher, I did not kind of inculcate culturally relevant pedagogy into my classroom. I wasn't that familiar with it, but when I got into higher education, there was something that I tried to actually infuse into my research. Right. So I look at like engineering design challenges. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to develop culturally relevant engineering design challenges, and I want to kind of see some of the research around that. But there was one, because there's three tenets to it, right? It's basically academic success, make sure that the cultural competence of the students is adhered to, and also developing this critical consciousness. And that was something that was really lost. And I think that's a very important aspect that people kind of disregard when they think that they're doing something that's culturally relevant, right? So they'll do something that's kind of multicultural in nature, they'll bring it in, but I don't think it really kind of fits the mold of a culturally relevant pedagogy.
Because of the critical aspect?
Yeah, because of the critical concept. I think that's very important, right? So it's really the teacher taking on a responsibility to really develop a like thoughtful and critical citizen, right, in anything that they engage. And a lot of teachers really might not feel like that's their role necessarily.
That seems like a good segue for something else I wanted to talk about. I was also thinking about the critical consciousness piece, and I often think about critical citizenship with students and like preparing them for democracy and sort of what is the purpose of education. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Freire at all, and his concept of critical consciousness that I can't pronounce because it's in Portuguese and it's that beautiful word at the top. But I pulled these other quotes from other education scholars to share with you. So only the educated are free. education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. America's future will be determined by the home and the school. The child becomes largely what he is taught, hence we must watch what we teach and how we live. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And then with guns you can kill terrorists, and with education you can kill terrorism. So I just think these span a long period of time, going back all the way to the Greeks, and then obviously in the 20th century, and then today with Malala. And just what are your thoughts of like what is the purpose of education, and thinking about culturally relevant, and when we have academic success, cultural competence, but then also that critical consciousness piece, how do we bring that into our teaching? And if you guys have any thoughts about that.
Kind of deep.
Yeah.
Can you maybe restate the question?
Sure. So really the question's up there, but what do you think is the purpose of education? Maybe it's too broad.
Maybe it's just something to chew on for
I think it's redefined in this century because now we have 21st century education. Purpose of education is making our students global citizens, to empower them to become global citizens, and then they will be able to understand this diversity and they will respect it, and they will be part of the global world. That was a part of my study, so I just recall it. So to empower our students become global citizens.
Yeah, I think that citizenship piece is really key too. Just thinking, what does it mean to be a global citizen then? You know, what does it mean to be part of a citizenry of people? And I think you touched on that a little bit, but like the critical aspect of that too, of critical awareness and consciousness and activism and all those pieces that are part of it.
So before I answered your question, I wanted to ensure that I really understood what critical consciousness was about and what the theory truly means. And so one of the first things that popped up was that education provides you a sense of privilege. And so I wonder if the purpose of education is to provide the individual who is being educated with a level of privilege within society.
It's an interesting point. So Freire was working in Brazil with students that were not privileged necessarily in the society, and so for what he was doing and building his theory about critical consciousness was awareness of the world. So it's a combination of reflection and action. So it's reflection, and understanding and awareness of what your surroundings are, what your positioning is in order to act upon it. So there's two parts of it. It's not just awareness and consciousness, but it's like being critically reflective of it and then also leading into action. So I think that's at the heart of it too. And I guess that's sort of what Dr. Denson sounded like you were saying. But when you bring in culturally relevant pedagogy into your classroom, you're pushing your students for academic success and then cultural competence. But if you don't push them to that next level of action for their communities, then you haven't fully reached critical consciousness. I hope that helps. But.
Okay. Two more.
Growing up, a lot of my family emphasized the purpose of education is money. Most think that getting an education will open up doors. The more education you get, the more money you make, less stress. In many cases, that is not true, because I know I have many family members who make well over $500,000 probably in a year, and they don't even have a high school diploma. But they have really stressful, labor-intense jobs. But I was always taught that you go get an education. The more education you get, the better the better income you'll have, the less stress job you'll have. And like I've even known people to go get master's degrees and PhDs, even though they really didn't want to get a master's or a PhD, but they went to get it just to have an easier job that paid more money. It's not they really wanted it.
I feel like that connects to the idea of privilege too, because it's like, if we look at education, which it is, like if we look at it the way that it is in society, it is this quantitative like ladder, these like hoops that you have to go over, and then once you gain it, then you can get this job, get this money, do these things. And then I think these like ideas of critical consciousness and like education, I don't know, I'm trying to say it in a different way, like, oh, to be educated, to learn all these things, yes, it is noble, right? That is, but then also to get an education in this system that we have is a privilege, is like stepping stones. It does lead to money sometimes, it also doesn't. And so it's like, how do we bring those together where it's like we can give people who haven't had access to these levels of education a more authentic experience getting those levels? It's like trying to make those connections. I can't quite get it. I need more time to think about it, but I like what we're saying.
So I don't know how relevant this is, or if I'm just kind of going off in left field. But like hearing you guys talk, I'm thinking about back home, where I'm from, and I mean across the board, wherever you're at, kids are being prepped to go to college, for 4-year degrees, and we have farmers, and small communities, and I'm looking and it says that, they are what they're taught, and I mean it in my mind, all I'm thinking about is the education that we're imposing on these students are not necessarily maybe what they need for their communities. So, I mean, the purpose of the education, is it really helping our smaller communities? I don't know if that makes sense. Does that make sense at all? I mean, because, we have farmers and tradesmen, right? And I want my house remodeled, right? But I can't find guys to do it because everyone's saying that you need to go to college, you need to do this, and you need to do that. But our small communities are falling apart because we look down on the farmers and we look down on the mechanics. And I feel like in that sense, our education is failing our communities, our rural communities at least.
No, I agree with you. Even when you look at the schools, they took shop out of schools. So even where a lot of students will get their first start at something like that, or just let's say you go to college, that's fine. You went to college, you get a master's degree, but can you change a faucet? Can you fix some things around your house? A lot of times, no. I mean, things that you might not need a whole mechanic for, a whole plumber for, but something that, can you do it? A lot of times, no. So these days, I agree with you. Education isn't always, it's not working necessarily for us.
And I really agree. And I can only really speak to the global perspective, but in my opinion, there are a lot of schools that do the opposite of promoting learning. And to me, in a lot of places I've worked, some of the smartest people never went to school. So, and actually I thought about it writing my cultural autobiography because I used to work with a lot of homeless children, street kids in Africa. And I also worked with school kids. And if you taught the same lesson to the school kids, every single school kid would nod in agreement, whatever. But if you said the same thing to any of the street kids, they would say, well, what do you mean? You know what I mean? Like they were so critical. And I just feel like in so many cases, school just makes you a sheep. You know what I mean? You just are reciting what you're learning. And I think that this test-based culture that we're in is doing that. I think it's really dangerous.
Just to jump off that too, and thinking about being culturally relevant with your pedagogy, and what a school might look like in a rural area should be different than what it looks like in an urban area. But when we have things like standardization and testing and other things, teachers don't have the autonomy to teach to the students that they actually have in their classrooms. And that's when we have some of that mismatch where we're not teaching them what they actually need.
So just to continue that line of discussion, and I think this sort of plays along with the, not giving our smaller communities what they need. I'm seeing this shift with the students I work with that I think is a direct result of that testing mentality, where the students, if they don't get something right on the first try, they automatically assume that they are a failure and they just quit at that point. They're not getting to that point where they can push through that failure and figure out what they did wrong, because they're being groomed for, if you don't get it right on this test and you only get one try, then that's it, you're done. And so working in a makerspace environment, which is what I've been doing for the last couple of years, I see a lot of students that they'll branch out just a little bit and try something new, but then as soon as it doesn't work the way they expected, they're done with it. They don't want to try anything else. And I feel like that sort of ties into what our students are getting, is not resilience, but just feeling like they're failures.
I was just listening to everybody. When I saw this, and when I think of the purpose of education, I think the issue is that when we educate, we think of an end result, and so we teach, and they always tell us to do things with the end in mind. But when you think about the purpose of education, that's not the goal. The purpose of education is to actually give somebody enough stuff that when they leave you, they can transform that into something else. And that's what we're missing. We're missing that transformative piece, and that's what education is.
I feel like that's a good way to wrap up, since I think we have to be done.
We can talk about this forever.
Yes.
I have a lot of thoughts, but I think that was really a great way of saying that. I think we would all be in agreement on that. So, yeah. Thank you for all of your thoughts.
Yeah.
Go to the message boards with more thoughts if you want, I guess.